The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. From the marbled floors to the high vaulted ceilings, the air inside the federal courthouse held a certain weight and invisible pressure that made everyone sit up straighter, speak a little softer, and choose their words carefully. The room had seen countless legal battles, but today, it was different. Today, there was a hum of something unpredictable, something electric, and at the center of it all was a man no one had expected, Tom Hanks. He entered the courtroom quietly, his stride calm and measured, dressed in a modest navy suit that hinted more at humility than power. His expression was composed but alert, his eyes scanning the room with the soft but penetrating gaze the world had seen so many times on screen. But this wasn't a movie, this was real. And Tom wasn't here to perform, he was here to represent. Representing a coalition of disenfranchised citizens in a civil rights case involving voter suppression, Tom had taken on the role of legal advocate after learning firsthand of the injustice affecting communities across Texas. While he wasn't a lawyer by trade, years of civic engagement, advocacy, and legal mentorship had prepared him more than most. He had joined forces with a team of attorneys, lending not only his voice but his presence, his weight, and his integrity to the case. For Tom, this was about more than the law, it was about doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy. As he walked past rows of court reporters, legal aides, journalists, and spectators, every head turned. Some stared in confusion, others in awe. Tom Hanks? Here? In court? Whispers echoed. Is that really him? Why is he involved? What does this mean? But Tom kept walking until he reached the plaintiff's table. He nodded to his legal team, exchanged a silent glance with the lead attorney, and sat down with the poise of a man who knew exactly why he was there. From the bench, Judge Andrew H. Stones watched the scene unfold with a look of faint amusement. A 67-year-old veteran of the judiciary, Stones was known for his strict courtroom demeanor, his aversion to what he called theatrics, and his unwavering belief in tradition. His courtroom was his kingdom, and he ran it with the authority of a monarch who had never been challenged. He leaned slightly forward, peering over his reading glasses, his silver eyebrows rising ever so slightly. "Well," Stones said, his voice echoing across the hushed chamber. "Mr. Hanks, I understand you've taken quite an interest in our little legal affair here." The comment drew an awkward chuckle from a few in the gallery. Tom didn't flinch. "I take an interest in justice, Your Honor," he replied politely, his tone even, respectful yet firm. Stone's smile ate a slow, deliberate curve of the lips that did not reach his eyes. "Of course you do. Hollywood has always been full of righteous causes. I trust you're not planning to turn this courtroom into a stage." There, it was the first jab. Subtle, but unmistakably condescending. Tom merely tilted his head, acknowledging the remark but not dignifying it with a response. He had dealt with dismissiveness before. He understood that some people saw celebrity and automatically assumed superficiality. He also understood that the best way to confront arrogance was not with outrage, but with preparation. As proceedings began, the courtroom settled. The defense presented their preliminary objections, brushing off the allegations of voter suppression as exaggerated, anecdotal, and politically motivated. They portrayed the plaintiffs as opportunists looking for attention. Judge Stones nodded along, occasionally interjecting with questions that clearly favored the defense. When it was the plaintiff's turn, Tom stood. His legal team had prepared the opening statement, but they'd all agreed Tom would deliver it, not because of who he was, but because of what he believed in. He stepped forward, paperless, and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, the evidence we are presenting today is not theory, it is not opinion, it is documented fact. We are here because thousands of eligible voters were systematically turned away, misinformed, and in many cases outright denied their constitutional right to vote. This is not about politics. This is about democracy." Stones interlaced his fingers and leaned back in his chair. "And what do you know of democracy, Mr. Hanks?" he asked, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Have you played a president in a film I haven't seen yet?" The courtroom stiffened. Reporters began scribbling furiously. Tom's team shifted uncomfortably, but Tom remained calm. "I don't pretend to know more than the law allows, Your Honor," he said, "but I do know that when people are denied their rights, someone has to speak up, even if they're not wearing a robe." Stones narrowed his eyes, the smile gone. There was silence for a moment, the kind of pause that feels like the air is waiting to be cleared by something powerful. And then, slowly, Stones chuckled. "Well then," he said, "let's see if your facts are as compelling as your monologues." What followed was an exercise in slow, subtle sabotage. As Tom and his co-counsel presented their evidence statistics, affidavits, recorded statements, Stones grew increasingly dismissive. He interrupted frequently, sustained every objection from the defense, regardless of merit, and questioned the relevance of even the most damning documents. The climax came when Tom attempted to introduce video footage of polling places turning away voters. "Objection," barked the defense. "Inflammatory." "Sustained," said Stones, barely glancing at the screen. Tom's expression didn't change, but his hand gripped the edge of the table just a little tighter. "Your Honor, this footage shows poll workers illegally denying access to registered voters. It's directly related to the—" "I said sustained," Stones interrupted. "You may move on. This is a court of law, not a documentary festival." Murmurs broke out in the gallery. Even the stenographer hesitated before resuming typing. Tom closed the tablet and took a breath. And then Stones made his critical error. He laughed. It was loud, derisive, and utterly dismissive. "Mr. Hanks," he said between chuckles, "I must say, this is the most entertaining hearing I've presided over in quite some time. You come in here with your movie star charm, your dramatic pauses, your civic passion. But let me remind you, this is real life. This is the law, not some Oscar reel." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Tom looked up, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling for a man like Stone's clarity. He reached down, opened a leather-bound folder, and pulled out a document, then another, and another. "Your Honor," he said softly, "since you brought up real life, let's take a moment to talk about yours. May I?" As Stones blinked. "Excuse me?" "I've reviewed your record," Tom said, stepping away from the table. "Over the past 5 years, you've presided over 17 civil rights cases. In 12 of them, you dismissed the plaintiff's claims without trial. In 9 of those 12, the appellate courts reversed your decisions. In 3, they issued formal reprimands. In 1, your conduct was referred to the Judicial Conduct Committee. I have transcripts here." Gasps turned to stunned silence. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. Stone's face paled. "I came here to seek justice," Tom continued, "but I also came prepared to ensure it's not mocked, not by anyone, not even you." What had begun as a legal proceeding had transformed into something else, something mythic. A room that had once been the domain of one man's unchecked authority was now being reclaimed by truth, discipline, and moral clarity. And it was Tom Hanks not as an actor, not as a politician, but as a citizen who held the floor. Outside the courthouse, crowds began to gather as word spread of what was unfolding inside. Social media exploded with hashtags. "Number Hanks for Justice" began trending within minutes. But inside, Tom stood calmly as the first chapter of a much larger reckoning took shape. Judge Stones, still gripping his gavel, opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He had underestimated the wrong man. And for the first time in 2 decades, Andrew H. Stones was no longer in control of his own courtroom. By the time the courtroom resumed session the following morning, the energy in the air had changed. It wasn't the buzz of curiosity that had greeted Tom Hanks the day before. It was something deeper, more expectant. Word had spread beyond the courtroom walls. Local press had given way to national news outlets. Satellite trucks crowded the courthouse plaza. Protesters and supporters gathered side by side, some waving signs demanding judicial reform, others just hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had turned a courtroom into a national reckoning. Inside, the atmosphere was different too. Judge Andrew H. Stones, typically calm and commanding, now sat a little stiffer in his chair. His jaw was tight. His usual smirk had been replaced with a thin, unreadable line. The courtroom clerks were more cautious, glancing nervously at one another between tasks. The defense counsel was uncharacteristically quiet, eyes fixed on their notes, barely acknowledging each other. Tom Hanks entered again with the same quiet dignity. But this time, the room didn't just acknowledge him, they stood, almost instinctively, not formally, as for a judge, but in a silent show of respect. Not everyone, of course, but enough that it made a statement. Tom responded with a slight nod and made his way to the plaintiff's table. Before anyone could speak, Judge Stones cleared his throat. "Let us proceed with order," he said, "and I expect all participants to maintain decorum. This court is not a theater." Tom didn't respond. He didn't need to, because now, every move he made, every phrase, every document, every moment of silence held weight. It was no longer about status or fame. It was about truth. And the courtroom knew it. The second day was supposed to be procedural, a continuation of evidence presentation. But the tone shifted when Tom took the floor. He had chosen not to open with legal documents. Instead, he began with a story. He stepped to the front of the room and placed a single photograph on the screen: an elderly black woman standing outside a polling station in Texas, holding a registration card and a look of frustration. "This is Miss Laverne Nichols," Tom said. "She's lived in the same neighborhood for 63 years. She has voted in every single election since she was 18. But last November, she stood outside her polling place for 4 hours before being told she was at the wrong location after it had been moved without public notice." He paused, then moved to the next slide, a map showing the polling site's relocation 6 miles away with no direct bus access. "She doesn't own a car. Her son couldn't get off work, so she walked, in the cold, 6 miles. By the time she arrived, they told her the polls had closed." Gasps escaped from several seats. Stones shifted slightly. "I'm not here to evoke sympathy, Your Honor. I'm here because her story is not unique. We have 211 affidavits like this. Different names, different neighborhoods, same tactics. Deliberate, documented, discriminatory." The defense jumped in. "Your Honor, this is anecdotal, not evidentiary. We object to this emotional framing." Tom didn't even look at them. "It's evidence, Counselor. If you care to look at the signed, notarized testimony in your exhibit binder." And Stones held up a hand. "Let him proceed." Tom didn't smile, but his gaze hardened. He had anticipated every angle of resistance, every attempt to delegitimize lived experiences, so he turned to data. "Let's talk statistics," he said, changing the slide. "Of the 2,147 polling places in Texas last cycle, 642 were shut down. Of those, 77% were in predominantly minority neighborhoods. Coincidence or a pattern?" He moved quickly, laying out a timeline of closures, matching them to demographic shifts, showing how predominantly white districts had polling stations added, while minority-heavy districts lost them. He cited voter ID discrepancies, transportation gaps, mismatched databases. Every point was sourced, cited, and cross-referenced. The courtroom was silent except for Tom's voice and the rhythmic tapping of the stenographer. But what made the moment powerful wasn't just the numbers, it was Tom's delivery. He spoke like a man who had done his homework, not to impress, but to reveal. He wasn't dramatic, he wasn't angry, he was deliberate, steady, convincing. The defense grew more agitated. They objected at every turn. Stones overruled them less frequently now, though his face remained unreadable. Then came a moment no one expected. One of the defense attorneys, a brash young litigator with a flair for provocation, stood up mid-presentation. "Your Honor, we move to strike this witness's statements on the grounds that Mr. Hanks is not a licensed attorney in this jurisdiction. He is acting outside the scope of courtroom protocol." Stones looked up, almost relieved to have something to latch on to. "Mr. Hanks, care to respond?" Tom walked slowly to the podium. "Your Honor, I am not serving as counsel. I am a co-plaintiff and a fact witness. I speak not as legal representation, but as a citizen, one who has seen the evidence, contributed to its collection, and is testifying to its veracity." He held up his badge, the official designation granted by the court for him to speak in this dual role. "The motion to strike is moot. The court approved this arrangement weeks ago, unless the defense wishes to object to its own pre-trial stipulation." There was a pause. Then Stones nodded slowly. "Motion denied." The defense attorney sat down, red-faced. Tom continued with a calm intensity. He introduced video testimony from polling station volunteers, audio recordings from confused voters being misdirected, and finally, official memos that suggested knowledge of these irregularities within local government. Every new exhibit built on the last like bricks in a wall. Judge Stones was visibly uncomfortable, but restrained. He no longer interrupted, no longer smirked. He was listening because the room was listening. And then, toward the end of the day, Tom did something unexpected again. He turned his attention not to the judge or the defense, but to the spectators. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we often talk about democracy like it's some distant ideal, something we inherited and occasionally dust off. But democracy is fragile. It's a muscle. If we don't use it, it withers. If we don't defend it, it breaks." He paused. "I didn't come here to win a case. I came here to shine a light. And I'm not the only one holding the flashlight. Every person who came forward, every citizen who refused to stay silent, Every volunteer who documented violations, they are this courtroom's conscience. We are simply giving them a voice. Silence. Even Stone said nothing. Tom took his seat. He didn't look satisfied. He looked resolved. As the session adjourned, a strange thing happened. The audience stood, not in celebration, but in reverence. Even some courtroom staff hesitated, unsure of what they had just witnessed. It wasn't a legal performance. It wasn't a campaign. It was conviction, embodied. Outside, cameras swarmed. But Tom said little. He gave no interviews. He didn't pose for photos. He walked through the crowd as he had entered, quietly, purposefully. Because the real storm, he knew, was yet to come. And the truth was only beginning to speak. The third day began with a sky the color of steel and an air of something unfinished. Reporters outside the courthouse were no longer just local affiliates or political stringers. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox News had a correspondent on site, but none of them knew what was about to happen. None of them expected the dynamic in that federal courtroom to shift from simmering confrontation into full historical upheaval. Inside, the crowd had swelled. The courtroom gallery was filled to capacity, with some spectators lined up against the back wall. Congressional aides, civil rights advocates, former judges, and law students packed the benches, whispering nervously, clutching notepads and pens. There was no longer a question of whether this hearing mattered. It did. It had already surpassed its legal scope and entered the realm of national symbolism. Tom Hanks entered last. The room again stood. This time, it was unanimous. He paused only briefly, acknowledging the moment with a nod before taking his seat at the plaintiff's table. The legal team beside him looked equal parts tense and galvanized. The night before, they had worked through every line of the next presentation, what Tom called the pivot point. This was the day they would move from exposing procedural injustice to confronting institutional power. Head on, when Judge Stones took the bench, he looked 10 years older than he had the day before. There were dark circles under his eyes. The stoic mask had cracked. He banged the gavel once, but even the sound lacked confidence. "Court is in session," he said quietly. Tom stood. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to present a timeline of judicial conduct in civil rights litigation under your supervision over the past 5 years." The defense attorney practically leapt to his feet. "Objection. This is a personal attack. It's irrelevant to the present case." Tom turned calmly to the judge. "Your Honor, I respectfully argue that the conduct of the court is directly relevant when it has the potential to prejudice the outcome of the case. What we are addressing today is not simply an instance of voter suppression. It's a pattern of systemic disregard for such claims within this courtroom." Judge Stones blinked. The gallery leaned forward. "Proceed," he said quietly. Tom approached the projector and clicked to the first slide. "Morrison B. Epp, Texas Secretary of State," he began. "A 2023 case in which this court dismissed sworn affidavits from 114 voters without a hearing. Dismissed on procedural insufficiency, despite full compliance with federal filing standards. Reversed on appeal. Judges' comments in court transcripts include, quote, perhaps next time they'll try writing a coherent argument instead of waving emotional banners." The second slide, Henderson v. Texas Board of Elections. Leonsenling Arshar. Plaintiffs allege the illegal closure of 4 polling locations in Hispanic-majority counties. Dismissed. Sanctions imposed against plaintiffs' attorneys. The Fifth Circuit not only reversed but issued a formal opinion warning of judicial bias. Tom turned from the screen to the audience. "These are not isolated incidents. These are repeated patterns. We have documented 12 civil rights cases dismissed under similarly questionable circumstances, 8 of which were overturned. This is more than legal error. This is judicial temperament. This is culture. And culture, Your Honor, has consequences." The courtroom was a cathedral of silence. Then, slowly, Tom picked up a folder labeled Davis v. Texas Attorney General. This case, he said, was perhaps the most telling. He opened it and read aloud, "These people need to stop complaining about every little rule and learn to follow the law like everyone else." He looked up. "That was you, Your Honor." To a group of civil rights lawyers representing primarily African-American plaintiffs. Stones sat motionless, lips thin, face pale. "We have the transcripts, we have the recordings, we have the appeals court's decision, which referred your behavior to the Judicial Conduct Committee." A collective gasp. I don't bring this forward to embarrass anyone. I bring it forward because justice demands accountability, and accountability begins with acknowledgement. Um, at that moment, the defense team began to crack. One of the senior attorneys leaned in, whispering frantically to his co-counsel. A legal aide rushed to the back of the room. Court security watched, uncertain. Tom wasn't finished. He returned to the podium and spoke clearly into the microphone. Your Honor, given the pattern of conduct exhibited in civil rights cases presided over by this court, and given the documented reversals, reprimands, and investigations, we respectfully move for recusal. We believe this court cannot continue to preside over this matter with the impartiality required by law. Stones opened his mouth, but the words caught. He looked around the room at the reporters scribbling furiously, the students watching history unfold, the lawyers who had once feared him now nodding in grim agreement. The man who had ruled without question for 2 decades was being challenged not with shouting or defiance, but with evidence, precision, and composure. Tom looked him straight in the eye. This is not personal, this is principle. Stones glanced toward his clerk, then back at Tom, then down at his bench. We will take a brief recess, he said. His voice was almost a whisper. He didn't bang the gavel. Outside, the gallery erupted in quiet murmurs, then loud conversation. Reporters sprinted for the exits. Social media exploded. Tom Hanks just dismantled a federal judge. Reversal of power in room 5C. History is being made. Inside the courtroom, the plaintiff's legal team gathered their materials, whispering in disbelief. Some were grinning, one was crying. Tom remained still, hands folded, eyes calm. Because he knew what had just happened wasn't a victory. It was a shift. A transfer of moral authority from a robe to a man who had walked in uninvited but stayed because it was right. As the judge's chambers remained closed for longer than expected, whispers began to rise. Would he step down? Would the case be reassigned? Would the judiciary begin to reckon with its own? But Tom knew the answer didn't matter yet. What mattered was that truth had taken the mic. And everyone was listening. The courtroom resumed after recess, but the atmosphere had transformed. The spectators returned to their seats with eyes sharper than before, not just watching, but witnessing. The chatter was gone. Phones were off. Breath was shallow. Something irreversible had occurred in that break, not just a challenge to a judge's authority, but the unveiling of an illusion that had stood for years. And everyone now knew it. Tom Hanks sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, not triumphant but reflective, as if carrying the weight of what had just unfolded. His hands were steepled, his gaze directed downward, waiting for the next phase not of the trial, but of the reckoning. When Judge Stones re-entered, the gavel was still absent from his grip. His black robe seemed heavier now, draped more like a burden than a badge. He sat without speaking. For a full minute, silence blanketed the room. Finally, he leaned forward. Before we proceed, Stones said, voice low and strained, I would like to address the matter raised during the previous session. He paused again. There was a subtle tremor in his right hand. It is not the court's position to validate or deny public opinion, but it is my duty to reflect on whether continued oversight of this case serves justice or undermines it. Everyone held their breath. Therefore, he said, this court will defer to the appropriate Judicial Review Board for consideration of recusal. Until a ruling is made, this session is suspended. He stood slowly, and then without looking at anyone, he walked out. A storm of reaction broke. Courtroom reporters dashed for the doors. Activists cheered under their breath. The defense team looked stunned, like a trapdoor had opened beneath them. And Tom? Tom remained seated. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply closed the binder in front of him and exhaled. Outside, the crowd had doubled. The courthouse steps were packed. Camera lights flashed. Chants began soft at first, then louder. Justice for the voiceless. Truth over power. Let Tom speak. The entire scene felt like a turning point in American legal memory, and it wasn't over. That evening, the headlines lit up. Federal judge halts case amid allegations of bias. Tom Hanks forces accountability where the courts couldn't. Collapse in silence. How one man dismantled a legal legacy. Commentators on all sides weighed in. Some accused Tom of theatrics. Others called it one of the most dignified legal interventions of the decade. Civil rights attorneys flooded social media with support, some sharing their own past experiences in front of Judge Stones. Hashtags surged number judicial reform, number recuse Stones, number thank you Tom. The next morning, court officials confirmed that Judge Stones had submitted a formal request for emergency reassignment of the case due to external factors affecting judicial neutrality. Legal code, of course, dictated that such reassignment would require a higher panel's approval, but that was merely procedural. By mid-afternoon, it was official. The case would be transferred to Judge Maria Rodriguez, a known constitutional law expert with a reputation for impartiality. Back inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was something new, not relief, not celebration, but resolve. When Judge Rodriguez entered for the first session under her name, the courtroom didn't stand for her the same way they had stood for Tom, but the gravity of the moment was not lost. She spoke clearly, with firm cadence. This court does not inherit bias. It only inherits the facts. We will proceed accordingly. It was a subtle but unmistakable declaration. The shadow of Judge Stones was gone. That day, Tom didn't testify. He didn't present documents. He sat quietly as the team of attorneys he had empowered stepped forward, emboldened by his example. They introduced the very video evidence that Stones had previously dismissed: footage of voters turned away, polling place doors locked, uniformed workers giving contradictory instructions. This time, the evidence was not rejected. It was examined. Not a single objection from the defense was sustained. At one point, when a defense attorney tried to discredit a polling site volunteer on cross-examination, Judge Rodriguez gently interrupted. "Counselor, we are not here to question someone's memory of injustice. Proceed with care." The balance had shifted, and the reason was clear. At the end of the session, as Judge Rodriguez called for recess, she turned to the plaintiff's table. "I commend the court for its decorum, and I especially commend those who brought this case forward with integrity." The crowd once again stood not in protest, but in recognition. This time, it wasn't just for Tom, it was for justice, real justice. Outside, the crowd was chanting again, but not for disruption. They were cheering. And in the middle of it, for the first time since this began, Tom Hanks stepped to the podium. He didn't carry papers. He didn't prepare remarks. He just spoke. "I came here to stand beside people who felt invisible. I didn't expect a movement. I didn't expect a reversal. But I believe what happened in that courtroom shows that the system, however flawed, is still capable of reflection, of change. And that's worth fighting for." A reporter shouted, "Do you consider this a victory?" Tom looked around the crowd, the cameras, the courthouse steps. "No," he said, "I consider this a beginning." And with that, he stepped down, not above the people, not separate from them, but among them. He walked through the crowd, shaking hands, listening to stories, posing for photos not out of vanity, but out of respect. And though he had come as an advocate, as a witness, and as a citizen, he left as something more, a symbol, not of celebrity, but of courage when it matters most. Because in the end, the courtroom had become more than a legal battleground. It had become a mirror. And Tom Hanks had helped a nation see itself in it. Not with fury, but with clarity, and silence never felt so loud. In the days following Judge Rodriguez's appointment, what had begun as a legal case transitioned into a broader national awakening. It was no longer just about one courtroom, or even about the trial itself. It was about what the trial had revealed: layers of long-accepted injustice, hidden beneath procedure, masked behind civility. And now, with the eyes of a country watching, the system was being forced to confront itself in real time. As court resumed under Judge Rodriguez, the courtroom seemed to breathe differently. Proceedings were brisk, focused, and grounded in legal substance rather than personality. The witnesses were treated with respect. The defense was heard, but not humored. The plaintiff's evidence, video footage, statistical breakdowns, testimonies, and expert analyses was methodically presented and allowed to stand on its own merits. And through it all, Tom Hanks sat quietly. He no longer needed to speak. His role had changed from advocate to anchor. He had become the calm center in a storm he helped expose, but refused to dominate. He was there for every session, front row, back straight, eyes steady. And the world was watching. Across the country, universities began hosting forums titled "The Hanks Precedent." Legal commentators debated the implications of what had occurred. Law students quoted his courtroom lines. Civil rights organizations adopted elements of his approach into their own training programs. One publication wrote, "He didn't just play a hero, he became one when it counted." Then came the verdict. The courtroom was packed to capacity when Judge Rodriguez delivered her ruling. Her tone was composed, her logic razor-sharp. The plaintiffs have demonstrated, through clear and convincing evidence, that a systematic effort was made to suppress voter participation in specific communities. The documentation provided shows not just individual incidents, but coordinated patterns that constitute a violation of federal constitutional protections. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. This court rules in favor of the plaintiffs. There was no applause. Just a breath of unified, collective exhalias, though hundreds of lungs had been holding the same fear and were finally allowed to release it. Then silence broke. One person stood, then another, then all. And as they did, eyes turned to Tom Hanks. Not because he won the case, he didn't. The legal team did, the evidence did, the truth did. But Tom had made it impossible to ignore. He had created space for that truth to be seen, heard, and honored. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed to him again. He waved them off. "Today belongs to the people who fought to be heard," he said. "I was just one of the lucky ones who could amplify them." The settlements that followed were historic. Voting procedures in the affected counties were ordered to be overhauled. Oversight boards were formed. Millions in damages were awarded to those affected. But the real legacy wasn't financial. It was cultural. Federal judicial accountability was no longer a fringe topic. New legislation was introduced that required greater transparency in judicial decision patterns. Annual bias training for judges became mandatory in several states. Legal journals published editorials calling the case a reminder that the system can still course correct when the right people refuse to look away. And the right people had included Tom Hanks. Months later, at a civil rights symposium at Howard University, Tom was invited to speak. He declined at first, said he wasn't a scholar, just a witness. But eventually, he agreed on one condition: that he share the stage with 3 plaintiffs from the original case. When he finally took the podium, the audience stood. He waited until the applause faded, then spoke into the microphone. "You've heard a lot of stories about me in the past few months," he said. "But what matters is not that a celebrity sat in a courtroom. What matters is that a country paid attention. What matters is that people who had been ignored were finally seen." He paused, voice steady. "I don't believe in perfect systems, but I do believe in persistence. I believe in people showing up when it's inconvenient, and I believe in the idea that silence, while powerful, should never be our final word." The crowd erupted. That speech, too, went viral. Eventually, a documentary was produced, Echo in the Chamber. It traced the case from its opening days to the final ruling, focusing not on Tom's fame, but on the unheard voices he stood beside. He was interviewed, reluctantly. The final scene showed him visiting one of the original polling stations from the lawsuit, now reopened and reformed. He sat on the steps with Miss Laverne Nichols, the elderly woman who had once walked 6 miles to vote. The two of them just talked. No cameras, no performance. Just people. As the credits rolled, the screen faded to black. Text appeared. He never needed to raise his voice. He just needed to stand in the right place at the right time so others could finally be heard. And with that, the echo was complete. Not with spectacle, but with impact, not as a celebrity, but as a citizen. Tom Hanks had not saved the system. He had reminded it who it was supposed to serve. And for the first time in a long time, the system listened.